So today I'm joined by Samantha McCann. She is the stewardship manager at the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is one of the world's largest nonprofit environmental groups. It boasts goals such as conquering things like biodiversity loss and climate change. And Samantha McCann is one of the people making that happen. Thank you for joining me, Samantha.
Of course.
It's awesome to have you here, honestly. This is going to be our very first interview, so I'm really grateful that you have decided to be my guinea pig. And as I understand, you're coming straight off of field work to be here. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. Happy to be inside today. I was in the field yesterday and the day before in 90 plus degree weather. So,
I did want to mention that we got introduced in kind of a funny way. We actually met through TikTok, where I was talking I was talking about black-footed ferrets, and you just slid into my comments to let me know that you actually worked with them before.
yeah, that was a really fun video to see because the project I did with them was during my first year in the conservation field, and I just passed my 10-year mark.
Wow. Well, you do have quite the stacked resume. I see that you've been based in a bunch of different organizations, all surrounding conservation. You seem very, very strongly rooted there. And you've been to a
Definitely.
bunch of different state organizations.
Mhm.
How did you get involved in things like this? Did you always know that you wanted to be a conservation person?
No, it was kind of a random start. And then once I started getting on that track, I just stayed on it. I'm actually from Chicago. I grew up in a very urban environment. And when I was in high school, I worked at PetSmart. And that's when I really figured out that I liked working with animals. And like I started thinking about their habitats, like a desert lizard needs sand and a iguana might need more humidity. And then when I started volunteering at the Shed Aquarium, because I didn't go to college right away, so I decided to volunteer. And that's when I was really like, I don't want to work with captive animals. Maybe I should help wildlife where they naturally are. And so I went to Missouri State University and studied wildlife conservation and management. And when I got going with that, I just fell in love with it. And I knew that I wanted to work in the public sector. And if I had to work for a living, why not do it helping the environment?
That's a great way to say it, honestly. I think a lot of people are really interested in your career path because though I, as someone who's also been in academia, know about conservation work myself, I think a lot of people don't even realize that's something that they can major in college.
Yeah, you definitely see the environmental studies or environmental science majors a lot. And wildlife conservation and management, like I Missouri State's probably the only one I know of that has that exact title. You might see wildlife biology, but I always like seeing things at like a practical level, like on the ground and not under a microscope. My brain just doesn't work that way. And so my degree path really combined biology and agriculture and land management. And that I really liked. I like seeing differences made physically on the ground, actually out in the field.
And do you feel like in your job now at the Nature Conservancy, that's something you're still able to connect with, getting your boots on the ground and seeing that kind of instant result?
Yeah, definitely. It's at a much different scale now. Definitely earlier in my career, I really looked at particular sites and how the habitat was being improved and the work that was happening on specific sites. Now I see things more from like a real estate mindset where you can't have the habitat unless the actual tract of land is protected in perpetuity. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's either by that land being under a federal or state agency or from a nonprofit or accredited land trust. And so getting those properties in the right hands is the first step. And then that sets the stage for the people to come after and do more of the land management.
Yeah, yeah. So you kind of alluded to it, but a lot of your work involves things like land trusts and conservation easements. For the uninitiated, could you break that down in your like best way?
Yeah. So how I usually explain it is, properties can be under either the federal government, state governments, municipalities, so county parks, city parks. And then there's the nonprofit sector. And typically the organizations that own land or manage land are called land trusts, but their names can vary. Like the Nature Conservancy is technically could be considered a land trust, but we don't have that in our organization name. And the main thing that these land trusts do, while they could own land outright, which we call fee title, is when they own it 100%, they could also work with private landowners to do conservation easements. And this is something that got more popular in the 70s because the federal government and the IRS started giving tax benefits for people to do conservation easements. So think of like an access easement or a utility easement. It gives another entity rights over certain property rights that the landowner might have.
Mm-hmm.
So usually a landowner will approach us and they say, I have 1,000 acres. I'm only using it for hunting or for timber management. So why not restrict my development rights? And we come in and say, yes, let's restrict your property rights. So they grant us some of their property rights, so development, mineral rights. And we literally write a document that says, okay, you can still build, but it can only be in this 5 acres. Or you can still create ponds, but you can't build more than 10 acres of ponds.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can make new roads and make new trails, but we have to approve it first. So we negotiate what property rights they're granting to us, and then we hold that as a conservation easement in perpetuity. So the property will be forever protected once that conservation easement is on it. And here in South Carolina, our audience is hunters and timber growers. And so the easements are written to still allow the property owners to use those rights after the easement is done. And the Nature Conservancy manages 160 properties that are protected. And
Is
that's
that across the United States?
across just the state of South Carolina.
Wow, that's
The
incredible.
number for the whole country is like real big.
Is there a significant size variation in those properties? Are some of them maybe just an acre, while others can be hundreds of acres, or?
Yeah, it depends on the land trust. So for us, our average is 2,000 acres.
Wow.
However, we do have one easement that's 30,000 acres, so that, sways that number a lot. We do have a handful that's under 100 acres, 40, 60, and that's honestly from earlier, like a decade or two ago, we protected those properties. Now we mostly focus on 2,000 acre average easements, but we are friends with like 20 other land trusts in the state. So if we do get approached about a smaller property, we hand it off to a partner for them to protect it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to circle back just for my personal clarification.
Yeah.
So land trusts are not inherently conservation easements.
Right. It's mainly like that's usually the primary.
Is
thing.
Every conservation easement a land trust? Kind of like the square is a rectangle, rectangle is in a square?
Yeah. So you have to be an accredited like nonprofit to be able to hold a conservation easement, be the receiver of those property rights. And there's actually an organization called the Land Trust Alliance that does the accreditation for these organizations. So if you want to make sure you're working with a really good land trust to protect your property, you can look at the Land Trust Alliance and find your local land trust that has that accreditation.
Got it. Okay. So there's some like overseeing over like the consistency of management over these. That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, what kinds of work can you get done on a conservation easement or a land trust? Is that all purely management work, or do you ever collaborate with like universities and do research?
Yeah, it's definitely a balance because we want the landowners to feel empowered to still be the primary interest holder on their property. So when I go to a property, I have to do annual monitoring. So I'm going to all of these places once a year. And what I'm doing is making sure that they're complying by the development restrictions. But really, I'm focusing on the relationship, getting to know them, figuring out how they use the property, encouraging them to do better land management practices. And I really don't want to overstep my role or imply that they have to do something per the easement that's not per the easement. And how I balance that is by getting them in touch with other organizations that will help them. For example, Quail Forever is having a much larger presence in South Carolina. So I usually tell landowners, hey, Quail Forever has farm bill biologists on the ground who will come help you with property management, management plans, funding. And so it's really that collaboration that's extremely important.
Does Quail Forever focus on bobwhite quail?
So they focus on multiple species, and they are now nationwide.
Incredible. You get to work with a lot of really interesting organizations.
Yeah. And here in the Southeast, like another example is Longleaf Alliance. They're a great nonprofit that really focuses on longleaf restoration. So they're another organization that I make sure my landowners are aware of.
Typically, when someone gets involved in, I don't know if donating is the correct word, but correct me if I'm wrong, donating their land to something like a conservation easement, is it that they reach out to you guys, or do you reach out to them because their land is of conservation importance?
Great question. So first I'll address the monetary benefits of doing conservation easement. So just to use some easy numbers, let's say a property is worth $1 million. And that appraisal is going to be based on how many tracts can you subdivide it and sell off? How many houses can you build? If they want to build a subdivision with 1 acre lot, that's a lot of value. And so we look at what the appraised value is before the restriction versus after the restriction. So let's say the property's value goes down to 600,000 from $1 million.
And that would be due to things like the development restrictions, not being able to build houses or apartment buildings there.
Right. Can't cut off a piece of it and sell it to your neighbor. So that 400,000, there's 3 things you can do. Either we will buy it. We will literally pay them $400,000 to receive those property rights, or they'll donate it and use that 400,000 on their tax write-offs, or do what's called a bargain sale, where we might pay them like 200,000 and then they use 200,000 on their tax write-offs. And another benefit on top of that is they're paying less property taxes every year because their appraised value is lower.
That's fair. That's fair. What are you mentioned hunters, you kind of alluded to farmers as well. Are those typically the types of people that would get involved? I would imagine that, because you're talking about thousands of acres of land.
Yes. So there are agriculture easements, and that I think that's primarily managed by the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a federal agency. The Nature Conservancy, because we care about agriculture, but it's not our main mission. We, at least in South Carolina, do not hold agriculture easements. However, we do address agriculture rights when we're doing an easement. So here in South Carolina, I would say most of our landowners are just using the property for hunting and timber management. So they are harvesting timber, replanting, but the rights will be specific as to how liberal those rights are, or how restricted they are.
So you spoke a little bit about how a big part of your job is that you go to these sites and you are checking out the property, making sure that it's being managed well, but there's a big part of building up that relationship with the landowner. Is that something where you see people tend to have issues after they've donated their land, or do people tend to feel typically good about their decision, how the property is being managed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I would say majority of the time they understand what they got themselves into, and I get along great with all my landowners. It's been really great getting to know them. Where the challenges come in are, we have easements going back to 1983. So sometimes a landowner from the 90s that protected their property in the 90s may have forgotten some of the things they put in this document. So I really try to casually oh, do you remember you have the right to build a dock still? And you just kind of remind them what they can do so that it's not as painful when I say they can't do something. And then the other challenge is if they sell the property, the easement goes with the property. So I have to meet this new landowner, get them oriented to what the property allows and doesn't allow. And that can be really challenging, but I don't mind the challenge. I try to just be really personable and be like, hey, neither of us wrote this document. We just have to work together to make sure that the property stays in compliance, because that's the goal.
When you were younger and you said that you were really into animals and wildlife and helping wildlife, which you definitely still do, did you ever think this involvement with private landowners was ever going to be such a big part of your job?
No, absolutely not. In college, I did hear there was this company that came, and it was an agriculture company, and they talked about working with private landowners and how it can be hard to really get private landowners on your side because they've been managing this land for years, or their family's been managing this land for years. So, really acknowledging that they've been doing a great job and here's how it can be better is a challenge. And I remember thinking I could do that. That sounds cool. But really most of my career has been focused on public land. So I never really thought of myself as working so intimately with private landowners. I just saw it as visiting public land. But when this job opportunity came up, I really wanted to work for the Nature Conservancy full time. And so I was like, why not? Let's try it. And the world of conservation easements is so much larger than I ever imagined. And it's been really fun. It's challenging. It's a new learning opportunity. I'm getting a new skill set. So I never imagined myself to be here, but I never really had an end goal. I just wanted to work in the public sector, get paid well, have a good quality of life. And so I've been really open to every opportunity that's come to me.
Well, it seems like it's really benefited you. I mentioned your resume is incredible. I checked it out and I was like, okay, so many different states, so many different organizations. But you seem like you've really stuck with the Nature Conservancy. I saw that multiple times. You've spent a lot of years there. How many years has it been now?
So my first 3 seasonal positions were with AmeriCorps. And are you familiar with AmeriCorps?
I actually am not, no.
Okay, so this is our country's best kept secret, unfortunately. There is basically a domestic Peace Corps. You can serve a term of service, and it is service. Think of it as military service, but it's not. It's really contributing to the public good in our country. And different nonprofits can host AmeriCorps members, and you get benefits such as student loan deferment and money to pay back your student loans, which is why I was so interested.
I think a lot of other people would be interested for those same reasons.
Yeah. So my first term was with Montana Conservation Corps, which is where I did the Black-footed ferret project. And then my second term was with the Nature Conservancy at a tallgrass prairie restoration site in Northwest Indiana. And that was my first, I didn't really know how big the Nature Conservancy was. But here I was on the site for 9 months. I got to interact with multiple land stewards, learn more about why they were making the decisions they were making. And this 8,000 acre prairie benefited from it. And I was just fascinated with that scale, because they weren't focusing on a single species. They were focused on the habitat and then the species would, benefit from it. So after that, I went to Texas for a little bit. And then again, I wanted to get with the Nature Conservancy again because the culture is just so positive. And so I worked for 2 different offices in North Carolina. I was on a seasonal fire cruise doing prescribed fire. And then I really needed a permanent job. The seasonal life was wearing me out. So I went back to the program in Texas and was on staff for a few years, getting that office experience because I'd been in the field only for most of my career at that point. And it was really that combination of my office skills and field skills that got me my current position with Nature Conservancy, South Carolina. So I've been in this position for 4 years.
Okay, very cool. In your time in AmeriCorps, when you were doing a lot of that seasonal work, were the folks that you were working with who had also joined like you, did they tend to have similar backgrounds to you? Were they all conservation activists or, biologists, or was it kind of a varied background?
Yeah, great question. I feel that in Montana, most of the people I served with were similar. We all recently graduated with some kind of environmental or biology or science degrees and, wanted that career path. In Indiana, definitely, I was on a small crew with 3 other young women, and we all wanted that. In Texas, it was more mixed. There was like recent high school graduates who just didn't know what they wanted to do yet and wanted to kind of take a gap year. But then there were people that wanted more of a career path like I did.
Okay, so it might be more program specific on which types of backgrounds. So I was wondering for my audience, honestly, I have a lot of people who come from academic backgrounds, and then I have some people who, with TikTok are very young, but they want to get involved. And so they might be those recent high school grads, things like that, with very little or likely no field experience. So they would be able to join certain programs through this, just maybe not all of them.
Correct. There are plenty out there that will gladly take you at 18 with no experience. That's what those programs are all about, is just offering those opportunities to people that might not get them in a normal setting. So it just depends. And honestly, people are welcome to reach out to me and tell me what state they're in, and I can direct them to what organizations are in their state. I still help a lot of people that I met in the previous position at Texas Conservation Corps. I review resumes, I review cover letters. I try to stay really engaged with people early in their career and help however I can.
Well, that's great. I will gladly drop your socials, your email, so that people can reach out to you for feedback or just general questions about this. I kind of want to circle back way to the beginning of this conversation because we've been talking about conservation, and conservation is a really broad term. So I kind of wanted to ask you, what does conservation mean to you? What does it look like? And has that changed through your time in this career?
Yes, definitely. I think I've always seen things from that tiers that I mentioned before: federal agencies, state agencies, municipalities, because each federal government agency has a different mission. The Forest Service is in the Department of Agriculture. They're about utilization. So we are supposed to use our forests while we're protecting. Whereas the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, is about public visitation, preserving land for future generations, a lot of aesthetics. And so that's their mission. Whereas U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they're focused on wildlife, especially migratory birds. And then you have Bureau of Land Management that, how it started was really focusing on private landowners being able to graze cattle on public land. So I was fascinated early in my career by that breakdown and learning the history of how those agencies came to where they are and have survived to present day. And then when you look at state agencies, usually their departments mirror those in some way. So I always kind of like broke it down by like mission and agency. Now and that's all land management. Now my view is a little different, where I still acknowledge all of that, but I see there's like different categories. So land management is one. Sometimes I get approached by people really interested in marine or coastal restoration. That's a totally different skill set. So doing an internship with me might not benefit you in the marine group. So just recognizing that that's a specific skill set. Then you have the people that want to work hands-on with wildlife. That's never been something I really wanted to do. I don't think I could catch birds on a daily basis.
That's actually what my background is. Yeah. I was the person out there mist netting, catching birds.
That's a specific skill set. Like, we want people to have that specific skill set so that they're good and handling wildlife carefully. And that data is so important. So I definitely started like seeing it as skill sets as well. My colleague that I'm up here and I spent time with him on Monday, his skill set's all in prescribed fire and, wildland firefighting. I want him to focus on that skill set so that he can really deliver on it. And then forestry is a whole different one because it's the combination of land management, and forestry is more about timber production. So being able to have that perspective is really important. So I see it both ways, and I really try to acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also worth pointing out, and feel free to throw in your 2 cents here, but all of your coworkers that you're working with that have these different backgrounds, your different background, a lot of that tends not to actually come from your academic background, but instead from your field experience and the projects you work on. And I think a lot of people, they see these people in these roles and they go, oh my gosh, I would never be able to work in forestry because my degree was just general biology. But they don't realize that a lot of the forestry people just started working on those projects initially, sometimes lower roles, and then they gain that experience. And now they're the person advising other people.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. You can definitely do the academic route and then stay on that clean route. But there's definitely a point where your field experience and hands-on experience outweighs your education. Like, when I help people with their resumes and they have a few good positions under their belt, I'm like, move that education to the bottom because it's not as relevant anymore. And they're always shocked.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that was something that you would look at when you're looking at resumes. Mm-hmm. Noted on my own resume there. I was wondering, so do you do a lot of public outreach in your role? It seems like you're working with resumes and other people who are expressing interest in joining, but do you work with the general public at all? People who just are curious about conservation?
Yeah. And a lot of what I do with helping people with professional development is my own interest. I do that off the clock.
It doesn't have anything to do with your role. It's just personal passion. You're just that good of a person.
Yeah. Because remember, I came from Chicago, so I wasn't familiar with any of this when I went to college. I didn't know the National Park Service existed. I didn't understand public land. And so this world has been so fascinating to me that I want to help others understand it more, because nature benefits when that happens. And that's actually why I'm on TikTok. I'm not as active making videos as I used to be, but when I first joined a couple years ago, all my videos were about public land in South Carolina. Here's this boat ramp. Here's how you get here. Here's this park. Here's how you get there. Just so it wasn't so scary for people to venture out. And different organizations have different budgets on how much they can advertise these places. So there might be places you don't know that are in your backyard. And I really wanted to highlight that for people.
I think you're doing a wonderful job with it. And like TikTok, as controversial as the platform can be for some people, I've seen so many scientists on that platform really kind of showing this like behind the scenes look at what it is to be a field scientist or work on forestry conservation, things that the general public does not know about. And I personally, that's how I started as well, was to talk about parasites. I've derailed a little bit with kind of going off into ferrets lately,
Yeah.
but
I do the
just
same thing. I just talk about whatever I want to now. Um, I'm just gonna circle back to the outreach thing because it is like super important to me. In my current role, I wish I could do more outreach and community engagement. However, I would say 75% of my job is conservation easements. The other 25%, I do manage the trail systems on our public preserves. And so I kind of just do it when I can with my busy schedule. And this week I'm in the upstate of South Carolina and I'm contracting up the Palmetto Conservation Corps, which is a AmeriCorps program. And they're doing trail work for me right now at our 9 times preserve. So that's what I was doing the last 2 days in the field, getting them oriented, doing some chainsaw work. And then they're going to be independent today and tomorrow. And then I'll join them on Friday again. So
are
it's
there
really
any
about,
sites that people in South Carolina might recognize that you work on?
yeah. So the one that's like the most loved is Peachtree Rock Heritage Preserve, which we co-manage with DNR. It's near Columbia. And then up here, Blue Wall Preserve is pretty well known and well loved. And in the Low Country, it's kind of like locals only know about it. It's called Sandy Island. It's a preserve, and that's an island inside 2 rivers. It's like the largest like freshwater island on the East Coast. So that's like a really big gem in the Low Country.
I don't want to get too derailed because I do know that you want to talk about the public engagement and reaching out to people. And I do too. I that is something I find I know I think it's incredible. I just also was like, oh, if you're working on trails, I'm sure there are people who actually would be really excited to know that a regular person who is very welcoming and is telling people to reach out to her manages those and would love to answer questions. But with public engagement, I guess one thing I want to know is what if you could achieve one thing, like reach out to everyone in the United States and convey one concept, what would that be?
I think just figuring out what's in your backyard because certain and I mean like your neighborhood, your county, because there's land trust here that just focus on one watershed or focus on one county. And so you might just not know that they exist because they're a small organization, sometimes a one-man show. And having your involvement, donating to them, whether it's your time or money, like it can really make a huge impact. So just figure out who the players are and you'll learn a lot.
Are there any easy sources for people to look that up, like websites or local resources?
Yeah, I wish it was easier to access. I would say start with the Land Trust Alliance. That's a really good one. And then just like look on social media. Like these organizations are getting better at using social media. I'll give a shout out to one organization in the state, Edisto Island Open Land Trust. They're a small but mighty organization, and their social media is awesome. Like, I love it. They do highlights on different plant species and wildlife species every week, and it's just so fun, and I like it a lot.
I will check them out. I'm always looking for more stuff like this.
Yeah.
You've talked a little bit about how people can get involved with helping these sites. You mentioned donating both time and money. Are all of these sites something that people could go visit freely, or are they protected and not always public?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say majority of the sites that the land trust will hold 100% of the interest on are going to be public. However, the Nature Conservancy South Carolina, while we only have 6 public preserves, we do have maybe, I would say at least a dozen properties that aren't open to the public and we just hold them. And it's because we're hoping to transfer them to a public agency and have it become public land. But money gets in the way and capacity gets in the way.
I imagine there's a
So
lot of paperwork involved with that.
so much paperwork. Yeah.
Are there any pros and cons to having a land trust be public versus private?
Kind of confusing because with a land trust, the conservation easements are going to be majority private. Like you cannot go on those properties. However,
And that's because they're owned by private landowners. It's someone's
correct.
personal land.
Yeah. So a few examples that are not private that I can give for our portfolio is we do have several city parks where we gave the property to a city or a county, and just to make sure it stayed conserved, we gave it with a conservation easement. So the county has to ask me permission to make improvements, and I still have to check those public lands.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of some good examples. Here in South Carolina, the city of Conway has this wilderness preserve that is on the Waccamaw River. We have an easement on that. I make sure they don't pave their trails and stuff like that. The city of Walterboro has, what do they call it? I think it's also called a wilderness or wildlife sanctuary. I make sure that they're not going to do anything crazy on that property, which they're not. It's just a public park. A really fascinating example is the city of Greenville. They have a water utility called Greenville Water. And back in like the 90s, we did a conservation easement with them. And so we protect a 20,000 acre reservoir and a 10,000 acre reservoir. So it's not all water, but it's all the water in those tracts drain into the watershed and the water utility that's used by Greenville. So it's not open to the public at all because the purpose of it is to protect the water supply of Greenville.
For the entire city.
Yeah, and the county.
Oh, wow. Wow. That is really impressive. Is that, so you would work then with a government organization or the local organization to manage that as well?
Yep, I work with a city utility.
That is an interesting cross section that I would not have expected.
Yeah. And people, they don't understand like, oh, why can't we go on the property? It's like, that's not the purpose of the property. And in turn, they do manage for conservation. They're using prescribed fire. They have a healthy bear population. They're monitoring their wildlife. They're monitoring their rare and endangered plants. So it's all very positive. But yes, the public is not the goal.
I mean, the public's health is the goal, but the public's entertainment with access to trails or things like that, that's not the purpose of that property. And
Correct.
That's understandable. Not every property benefits from having trails go through it. Sometimes they just need to be completely left alone. Mm-hmm. That's okay.
Yeah.
So when you're managing all these very different properties, it sounds like you have a swath of different ecosystems, from longleaf pine to reservoirs to prairie, I think you mentioned at one point. What is how are you managing those? Are you walking around with a clipboard and counting each tree, or?
I have an iPad. And so when I came on board, it was very overwhelming knowing that there's 180,000 acres that I'm supposed to know what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so it was actually like such good timing. The great thing about the Nature Conservancy is there's like a world office level and then a North America level. And so I have resources outside of the chapter to help me with this work. And there was a pilot program from the kind of the GIS space and land management space and the Nature Conservancy, where we were trying to create a infrastructure map that had all the points, lines, and polygons in a similar labeling. So if I called something a trail, another chapter could call it a trail, and they wouldn't accidentally call it a horse trail or a hiking trail, because they wanted numbers to be able to roll up and us to actually know quantities and metrics and measures. And so I was given this like great resource where I could start logging like this is where the building is, this is where the road is, this is where the trail is. And I actually did interns for 2 years that helped me with this monitoring and collected all of this infrastructure. So now when I go on a property and if I see a building that looks pretty new and I don't see it on my map, I can actually know like I have to check into this and make sure it's compliant.
That's incredible. So you said GIS, is that ArcGIS?
Yes, we use
Yes.
the whole Esri suite. So Field Maps is the app on the iPad, and then I use ArcGIS Pro and ArcGIS Online.
I'm sure any biology folks watching this are familiar with that and probably dread it, honestly. But for the folks without a bio background, can you give like a little bit of an explanation for what GIS is?
Yeah, and I'm going to be very honest that I avoided GIS for most of my career. Like I had the mindset, which is incorrect, but I had the mindset of like, I don't want to work inside on a computer. I want to be in the field.
I
So
think GIS
it,
is dreaded by almost every field scientist I've ever met, at least early in their career. So
yeah, I avoided it for a long time, but it's getting better. Like ArcGIS Online, I think, is a pretty new platform for Esri, and it's so user friendly. So I just had our GIS manager kind of get me hooked up with her data and ArcGIS Online, and I just learned as needed, to do this work, and it was all very user friendly, especially if you're like a millennial or Gen Z, like you'll pick up on it real fast.
there is something to say for like the younger generations bringing some newer technology, like your iPad,
Yeah.
into field work.
Yeah. I mean, it was only maybe 8 years ago. My colleagues still had GPS things and point and shoot cameras and clipboards. Like, we're not that far from that day.
We've gotten out of the Stone Age.
Yeah. And now with ArcGIS Pro, I've started learning that this year, thanks to my GIS manager, Melissa Strickland. She's amazing. And I just tell her, like, there's this workflow I want. Show me how to do it. So I don't try to learn everything. She just teaches me certain workflows that I need to use. And I've heard from people that ArcGIS Pro is so much easier than ArcGIS Desktop or whatever came before it.
This may be a misconception, but typically in work that involves land management and forestry and things like that, it's been my experience that it tends to lean towards a boys' club, which the laugh makes me think that you're at least familiar with that. I think it's been changing, but I'm curious if you have any experiences with those changes or any negative ones even.
Yeah, I really try to not let that stuff like get me down. My first time that was extremely obvious was when I worked in Texas. I was on a state park trail crew, and every park manager or park sponsor I came in contact with would talk to my male co-lead before they talked to me. Luckily, I had a great co-lead who observed this, and every time he'd be like, "What do you think, Samantha?" and kind of just act,
That's
like the dog
fantastic.
on me stage. And I saw it as a challenge. Like, you're gonna listen to me, you're gonna hear me, you're gonna respect me, and I just played the part. Here in South Carolina, I know that they're surprised when I roll up to the property and I'm not from South Carolina. Um, it's so funny. But I just be a person, I ask them their interest, how they use the property. I make observations and compliment their work and show them, like, I understand what you're doing on this property. I see the hard work you're putting into it. And I really try to acknowledge it. Something that's changed from the time I started to how I do my job now, that's earned me a lot of respect with my primarily male landowners, is I get really excited about wildflowers. If I see a bloom, I get like stoked. I can't help it. And so I'd be like, oh my gosh, it's our native petunia. And immediately they would say, does it have wildlife value? And I would be like, okay, I get the language you're speaking. So now my script is more for that, like, oh, these are real great quail woods. Did you know those legumes provide more protein for the quail? And I just put it totally in that vocabulary because we're talking about the same thing. I just need to use the vocabulary that interests them. And it really does get me a lot of respect with them. And I don't feel that I'm subject to those male female situations once I get over that threshold where it's like, I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you definitely do. I mean, you clearly know your stuff, and I'm glad that it's getting a bit better. And honestly, the more women that get involved with it, like yourself, the easier it becomes for the next women to step in as well, because they can look up to you as a mentor, a role model, and they can get away from those experiences that you spoke about where they're the only woman on the site.
Yes, it's you just have to get out there and just start changing the story, become more present in the field. That's how that audience is going to get used to us being in the room as opposed
Mhm.
to
So when you're talking about quail wood and the legumes that are good for quail and things like that, I mean, that's not like you're bluffing. I think a lot of people don't realize that plants, animals, insects, the whole ecosystem goes together. Do you find that there's a bit of a barrier when you're communicating that with folks, or is it picked up on well that, by preserving this longleaf pine like forest, you're also protecting habitat for many different species?
I think they get it for the most part. And it's really just all the vocabulary. Like, and I've always viewed the conservation audience like this. We all care about the same thing, but you're going to use a different vocabulary, whether you're a hunter, a birder, someone into herpetology. So just, it's good if you're trying to be a true conservationist to acknowledge every audience and let's try to bridge the gap. I do want to acknowledge, because I feel very strongly about this, that hunters are an audience that needs more respect and more acknowledgement because they are the top funders of conservation. They've been funding conservation for a very long time from the Pittman-Robertson Act, where all sporting goods gets taxed. The duck stamp that goes to our, fish and wildlife system. And so I think sometimes when you come from more of the feel good conservation where I came from, you just don't understand that narrative. But once you acknowledge, like, most of our public land are from hunters, Teddy Roosevelt, big hunter. So acknowledging, respecting, give credit where credit is due, and then let's go from there. A couple organizations I want to give big shout outs to are Quail Forever, because they're changing the narrative with quail management equals pollinator management equals habitat restoration, biodiversity, having, a variety of food sources for quail. They're working with monarch groups in the Midwest. Like, they're really piecing the puzzles together and bringing people together. And I just appreciate it so much. The other organization, this is not a nonprofit. It's the Meat Eater franchise, which is started by Steve Ranella. It started as a Netflix show. Now there's podcasts
I was
and
going to
love.
say, is that related to the Meat Eater podcast? I'm
Yeah,
familiar.
yeah, love him because um, his brother's a wildlife biologist, and I'll hear him on the show and how he speaks and the way he thinks about stuff. I 100% agree. And I think he's bringing that habitat perspective to hunting and making hunters really acknowledge the habitat component. And I appreciate it. Like, we all need to get on the same page. And it's nice that those groups that are hunting focused are making those moves, engaging with the non-hunting community.
I think that's really well said, that we all come from different backgrounds, whether that's hunting, whether that's enjoying wildflowers, and everyone, I don't think they realize it sometimes, but everyone has the same interest. They all are trying to protect the same land, even if it's for different reasons. We're getting close to our time, but I wanted to ask you, have there been any success stories or any changes in the land that you've seen that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so two fun ones. I'm gonna go back to the black-footed ferret
That's
thing.
a good way to close out.
Yeah, when I was doing that project, it was sponsored by World Wildlife Fund, and it was on the Fort Belknap Native American Reservation. And we were applying insecticide to prairie dog burrows to try to get rid of the fleas, which carry the sylvatic plague. So, you had to restore the prairie dog population first, and then they reintroduced black-footed ferrets to the landscape after I was done, did my time on that project. When I saw your video, I did look it up to see how they were doing, and they have reproducing populations of black-footed ferrets on that site now. So it was really cool to see, like, 10 years later, like, that worked.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, you were a stepping stone on the way to helping an endangered species get back into its natural habitat.
Yeah, that was awesome.
That's fantastic. Are there any other sites that you'd like to shout out? Any organizations?
Yeah. Okay. One other one is where I did my AmeriCorps term. It's a tall grass prairie restoration called Kankakee Sands. That's in Northwest Indiana. It's a Nature Conservancy site. Something that they did that I got to participate in that I didn't realize was so rare, was native seed production. So we actually collected seeds from like an 8-mile radius, I think, from the preserve to preserve the genetic diversity or uniqueness of that area. And it was just really fascinating. Like, I think we collected over 100 species of seeds to put back out onto the landscape. And I just don't see that in other regions. I think the Midwest is really good at that stuff. But I do get like concerned when, we're buying seeds from Tennessee or wherever, but how about the South Carolina plant genetics? Biodiversity matters in genetics and the seed diversity as well as species diversity. So I just really appreciated Kankakee Sands for like having that program and having me participate in it. And a huge win that they had is they reintroduced bison to the site several years ago. So there's a bison herd, and they are now hiring a land steward right now. It's posted on the website. So if you have background in this and want to work hands-on with bison and native seeds, they are literally hiring a full-time position.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, hopefully someone takes them up on that. That's fantastic. Well, thank you again, Samantha. You have been fantastic to talk to. I love hearing about how you're bridging the gap between hunters, private landowners, and the forests that they exist in. It's fantastic work. You seem like a wonderful person. I'll be sure to shout out your socials, your email, and any other organizations that you might have forgotten about in this conversation. But it's been wonderful talking with you.
Thank you so much. I had so much fun.